grid is a safe space to start work. I'm interested in like this space, this other space, flattening out of a tesseract cube, similar to how you're interested in flattening out an object, but it's stopping. It's important, and not like overworking it, because I'm aiming to capture that energy. And typically I start and finish in one day. Geometry is something I think about.
The body being in there too, right? Or that's one reason I put you next to like Lauren's work, because it is that grid, but the body is inherent too, or maybe that comes in later subject matter wise, or
yeah, I think
intuitively.
I think it's coming more forward, because what I found with my previous work is that I'm not activating the space so much. It felt more like I was kind of, it's meditative practice. I can stop and start whenever I want. I'm not as present as I want to be. So now it's like, oh, now I want to be in the paintings. And I do like how you install the paintings, because if I stand over there in that side of the room, I can see both of them together. If I stand, look at the mirror in the bathroom, I can see the other painting as a reflection from the mirror.
Yeah.
And I like that aspect, that it's playing like kind of these like, two places at once. Now I'm loosening up with a lot, my more recent work, I'm trying to break free from the grid. And that's probably the reason why I'm doing, I'm breaking up the grid, trying to just like escape like what I'm usually doing, and, kind of develop my own language somehow.
Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with even making a one hour painting. Could be, you knock that out, or Michael actually, we've talked about like you meeting Agnes Martin one time, and I don't know, would she give and take maybe do a painting in a day, or maybe it was 2 days, but the focus and the energy was like, oh, I'm dialed in, this is the energy. And it's like you have all this complexity, is the point I guess I'm arriving at with that, with the line in the forefront and all of that energy between the two, with these like beautiful skipping gestural lines over it, that this like kinetic energy, which is all embedded in there.
Yes, the gestures are coming from it's a figure. It's actually it's called a Lascivious Figure, a mathematical figure that this scientist found in 1850s, late 1800s. But it's a way to describe a visual representation of sound. So sound is something I also think about. I play music, and sometimes I listen to the same song over and over. And actually for this painting, I don't know how many times I listened to this song, but it's up till I completed the painting.
There's a similarity to Lauren's work.
Yeah, I definitely see that too in your work, because I see a human figure.
You mentioned that you're interested in maybe leaving the grid behind.
I'm comfortable with like the evolution, what's happening with the paintings. Like even right now, there's absolutely no grid at all, but in my larger painting that I'm doing, but there's one that I did with the grid, because I'm trying to understand, like, do I still need this grid? Or maybe I don't need it anymore. Maybe I don't need it anymore.
Ryan DeWalt's work, and his work I've known for some time. And we have a nice selection of both Ryan's works on paper from not too long ago, which you can see reference the grid right off the bat, with the chlorophyll forms, or use of that medium. But there's so much like chance and gesture even within the rigidity of that mark making. And then moving on to the light pieces and the relief pieces, referencing the TV format, working with ferromagnetic material, but so much like intensity of like you needing to come up to it. But then like these beautiful like homespun references to bedding and quilts as well, and like the hand is inherent in there as much as there's light.
Yeah, the grid for me was a way to sort of be quiet and stop talking in a way. I've always been interested in pigment as an object and color as somehow an architecture. And the grid allows me to kind of map that and look at that a little bit closer. And at the same time, I'm using, like you said, electromagnetic fields and ultraviolet light. For me, the grid really is encompassed by the electromagnetic spectrum, which includes radio waves, gamma waves, every kind of oscillation possible to manipulate matter. So I wanted to work at both ends of that spectrum. So ultraviolet light allowed me to get right up on the edge of visible light, and magnetism allowed me to incorporate the invisible force of magnetism. And I brought those two things together by creating pigments that would fluoresce under ultraviolet light, but also would be held to the surface of the paintings with magnetic force. So these paintings actually are emitting an invisible force. Our bodies are also bioelectric, and so that those forces are sort of blending and mixing, and whether we know it or not, we're sensing that. I'm interested in the invisible world, and I'm interested in somehow sensing the invisible and what's beyond the visible. And of course, you have to utilize material to do that, but the grid allows me to kind of open that space up and really investigate a broader sense of the visual into these sort of other realms of the invisible or the intuitive or the sensation, broader sense through the body.
I feel like we have a very similar process where we start with like the material, like touching it, feeling it. What is the possibility of how far I can push this? Do you know what I mean? It like really starts like, what does ultraviolet light mean, and how can I manifest that into something? And I feel like the grid kind of gives you a place for that to really play. Do you know what I mean? At least for me, that's how I think about it. It's like, if I can do this with paint, what else can happen? If I can do this with wood, what else can happen? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it always feels like, at least to me when I was in your studio in the same way, I feel like I am too. It's like, I want to touch things, I want to be in it, you know, messy and in it.
I mean, I think your study of optics is very interesting and extraordinary. But there's something that's very accessible in these images based on your source, right? The monitor, and how you were just observant of the ordinary, just like maybe a little bit extra than most people, in the sense that like you magnified the basic pixel, its property is something extremely familiar to viewers, and when that's told to someone, they immediately get that part.
Right.
And then they're enjoying this less accessible, but extremely accessible, because they're actually able to experience it, whether they understand all the properties that exist or not. So there is kind of a flip-flop, which is also similar with some of these other works like Jeff's and Lauren.
The larger piece is the scale of my Vizio LCD screen. I was doing this work, I guess, when I lived by myself, and I was doing this work during heavy lockdown. So most of my information was coming from the screen, and I'm a teacher, so I was also teaching through Zoom meetings and creating online content. I had never engaged the screen to that level before. I think a lot of us probably had that experience. It became almost like a real place to me. And I started wondering about the architecture of it. And I really wanted to create a painting that would have the sense of that back illumination. I started videotaping my screen really close and zooming in, and the pixels would break down into the red, blue, and green. And so I started to sort of turn that into paintings that would actually function like those do in the monitor themselves. For example, in a pixel, you have 3 different color capsules, and they have phosphorescence in them. And when you put a different amount of electricity into each one, you get brighter or less bright green, blue, and red. And in the grid of the screen, you can create variations that will very much like, well, it tricks your eyes into seeing a picture. So I wanted to externalize that space into an environment. So I made 12 paintings in an environment, created these black light sculptures that would illuminate those. And it was kind of like like turning the screen like inside out or something, so that you could then embody it in the physical and in the present time, which I felt like I was really not experiencing during that period of time, which is what Michael's talking about in the 2 smaller works in the back there.
You're trying to replicate, an additive color system, or mimic or an additive color system, but using, traditional subtractive, materials. You're using materials, you're using pigment.
Right.
And so it's interesting to see, I guess, how you're thinking about the relationship between additive and subtractive color.
Right, and the fluorescing is that Z-axis, right? Mm-hmm. It's a radiation. It's a type of radiation.
The immersive experience of the quality of light, the also sound that's composed with it, that to me it's like, it's cinematic what you're viewing, and there's light at play, there's sound at play, but then you also get to just enjoy like the nooks and crannies of the textures you're showing and all the things in terms of the light and the magnetism. It's a film in a way, but I get to have time like looking at how the light plays off of the handmade quality of how the wood is made and the light on that, and that little bit of thread that is like sewn through the actual wood, forms that are springing out in a plant-like way, and then doing their thing. Treating myself as almost a viewer seeing this for the first time, and it's just so wild, and then to have this beautiful surprise in the back of the room. Let's start with Lauren, since she's here with us. So Lauren Comito I've known for a good stretch and enjoyed her work for a number of years. Her work, getting to know it, largely stems from, I think there's a lot of resources at play and references, but taking packaging material, we talked about that with Jeff's work as a source material, but with you, not necessarily like the surface of the packaging, but flattening out the packaging material itself, whether it's like a iPhone earpod case or whatever, taking that out, flattening it out to this beautiful graphic structure, whatever is appealing to you, and from that going into this like using the geometry of that to be the composition of your works, and then going off in like a beautifully like wild direction in terms of kaleidoscope, using the symmetry of it, certainly using the grid, and then creating these figures that are figures. Then it's back to this beautiful abstraction, then it's figurative again, like portals into another world, and all kinds of things, let alone the beautiful surface, which are these, they're essentially like these beautiful large watercolor surfaces that from talking to you and Michael and I were in your studio, a very hard fought, maybe that's, or where you'd like to be more playful, but like the sophistication that you really worked at to have these playful like watercolor like surfaces, but again, just like the invention of working from these packaging materials and then going in your own direction.
Thank you, Peter. The absorbent ground that I'm working with, you were referring to it as hard fought.
Yes.
I have been working this out for the last decade, quite literally. And I feel like I've finally, these paintings I made a year ago, but the ground that I would say is now like exactly what I want, that I've been using in the more recent work.
Yeah.
I'm very excited about. Not to say that this ground doesn't work. But yeah, the relationship between the grid, abstraction, and when you fully arrive at an image. I'm very interested in that kind of strange space, like between abstraction and the recognition of an actual image when it materializes for you. And I like to be playful with the viewer. I want to give them something to feed into, and to allow the viewer to come up with their own associations.
I like it on a lot of levels, and I think, you know, Michael has touched upon, or like even like the heavily like figurative elements or fertility goddess elements, all things, but just all the associations you can bring to it. And then, like everyone in the show, then you can kind of empty your brain of that and like look at this beautiful abstraction and what's at play. Everyone has their energy they're bringing to the show. Some it's like, or like touching on maybe like Carrie's work, it's our in a way, but then there's like this beautiful compression to the work as an object. And on like another point, your work, it has that figurative inside, and then it's literally like with the angularity of like the lines, this outward kaleidoscope energy like rushing outward, but all the while like bringing you back into the structure. And then these very interesting like mysterious like portals at play, which both can rest on the surface of material, but then also like these alien forms that are both a figure and a spaceship like touching down into the gallery or something like that, and like they're viewing us for the first time as much as we're viewing them. But the playfulness of them, while they're also like these structures and how, like, you know, the workmanship of them. And we haven't really talked about the smaller works, but just how, you know, like making a really, or well-made, or like something that's a piece that has that clarity and summation, like a 10-inch by 10-inch painting might seem easy for somebody, like, oh, that's a statement in its own right, but not easy to do. And in your small works, you do that. Those are really nice statements that have the energy of the big ones, but they've got other, and the drawings that we have, maybe I'll put it if you were going to say. And we had equally important to us, and when Michael and I installed the show, was the beautiful mini gallery in the bathroom. But like the energy of the drawings are like really beautiful, and that there's a grid inherent in that, but these eye forms and different things that play that in someone else's hands, maybe you're like, oh, I see the eye, I see the mouth. Those things are in there, and then it flips right back to just this whole image, which is consistent in all the work of these like beautiful moments, then boom, right back to this whole image. And there was a reason that with that, it seemed like a really, at least with one of your larger paintings that we have in the gallery, it seemed clear to have that to be the statement that goes out into the street and faces out into the street, is like this nice sort of welcoming image.
When I first came to your studio, the first thing I noticed was, I was wondering if there are watercolors, and you really have like kind of mastered this beautiful wash that hovers between like form and light. And I was talking to a scientist the other day, and he was talking about the light, you know, that's filtered through a volcano, and it's somewhere in between light and shadow. And to a certain degree, some of these properties of the light form have that kind of combination of whether it's form or light or the architecture of space, or just using, like Peter said, the everyday object, the packaging material to go into this otherly world, finding these figures and being inventive, but wherever it seems to take you, as far as your imagination.
The whole idea about like the three-dimensional form that is flattened and used to basically lay a groundwork for the architecture, for the structure to be built on top of it, you know, that's very much what's going on in these paintings. You know, going from an XY to an XYZ, you know, axis. But thinking about like, you know, these packages, these containers that we all live with, we probably like threw one out today, at least one, if not like 2 or 3. But there are all these objects, there's all this detritus that we're surrounded by. that we're actively participating, you know, in continuing, you know, this kind of like the consumer waste that we're surrounded by, right? It's unavoidable, especially living in the city. And I do think a lot about future worlds and what, I guess, how will the worlds of the future be shaped by these objects that we just kind of take for granted? The very, you know, everyday, commonplace object, the beer can, you know, whatever it is, the styrofoam encasement that your TV monitor came in, whatever it is. But I do wonder about how those forms will influence future structures.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, they almost seem like they could be a novel cover for like Philip K. Dick or something.
Yeah, I'm a huge sci-fi fan.
Okay.
So
It's in there.
yeah, Metropolis.
Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, there's also like it's really nice to have like a feminine voice in that way too, because a lot of times you talk about architecture, it's within like a box grid, right? The grid, which is actually quite masculine sort of space, and to think of it as like a rounded, curved space, we're thinking of it in dualities. But anyway, because there is like obviously boobs that are like, you know, I don't know, have breast milk coming out of them in some way, you know, like, so it's interesting to take these like very masculine sort of like gridded objects that package our iPhone earbuds to then become that. Anyway.
Yeah, I'm actually really glad you brought that up. Yeah, I mean, even just looking at this phone, right? It's interesting to see what has happened to corners, hard edges. It's like we live in this world where all of the edges and corners are simply rounded.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know what it means. I don't know what it's interesting.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. But I also think it's interesting to think about it as relating to, you know, the feminine. Yeah.
The last artist who couldn't make it today, an artist I've known for a while, and I think a number of artists here, Otto Epstein. He largely works on paper, or has been for a number of years, but the panel and painting on panel has been a big part of his process. We've showcased 3 boxing paintings, as he calls them, and they're all titled Knockout 1, 2, and 3. There is on the surface, the masculine energy of essentially 2 boxers fighting each other in each of these paintings. But I think what's great about Robert's work, I mean, on a certain level, and the grid is super apparent right off the bat. He basically works in, I think the scale of the block has usually remained pretty consistent in both his drawings and his panel, where it's roughly maybe a 1/4 by 1/4 inch. And while if there's a figure or not a figure, or he works with rug patterns and all kinds of references, there's it's very like democratic in terms of it's you know, it's all the same block to him, and how he works is, you know, yes, certain imagery in the foreground imagery is going to pop out, but he goes line by line, block by block, and each of them have the same care and same focus to them, but from the prep of the work, then the imagery he wants emerges. But what I liked about him is that even if you see these heavy figurative impulses, which I wanted for the show, and a little bit of that different energy coming in from some of the more abstract and the blending of abstract and figurative, the hierarchy of his images, I think, reverse constantly on themselves. You're looking at the quote-unquote background, whether it's this like rug type pattern or even a crossword puzzle or Rorschach element, then you're back to the figure, and then you're back to the background. And it's just like, because of the intentionality, again, of the mark making is so democratic, that's what I really like about these. And the closer up you get, the image is obliterated, there's the connection with Jeff's work, you get back and like, boom, there's this like beautiful like image that he's all had in his mind. And I think he himself, and in his statement, is he, like any of us do, he has an idea of what the image might make, but you know, just like it is, it's like it might be heavily prepped, but once it comes times for the mark making, he doesn't essentially know the charge of that color next to, say, a white block, or vice versa, and that's where the energy comes in. And I might turn it over to anyone familiar with Robert's work if they have anything to say on that.
Yeah, so he started, first time I met Robert, he was making these sort of, they were cross-stitch patterns from like a 1970s magazine that he had found. And the square, the blocks were maybe a quarter inch by quarter inch. He showed him a transmitter. That's when I met him. And then he's incredibly prolific, constantly working on these things. It's really funny that he just works left to right, all the way down. He uses color pencil, he uses oil on panel, acrylic on panel. And one of the more beautiful things about these, I think, if you get up close, you can really see the brush stroke, the control of the brush stroke within that little tiny box.
Yeah.
He's one of the most obsessive people. I could not make these paintings. I don't know that I would have that ability.
Myself included, yeah.
It's really intense. It's a great deal of intensity on one surface, and they're quite large for having such small squares. He does change his square size depending on whether it's a drawing or whether it's a painting or whatever. I'm not sure how he decides that, but the imagery he'll put through, I forget what program he uses. He just like bitterizes it so that it blocks it out like this, so that he can then use it as this composition. Yeah, so, and sometimes there's a great deal of humor in his paintings. These are a little more serious, I guess, just in the fact that the subject matter is like boxing. I don't know, Michael, do you have something?
I do love this particular series of images. It's just kind of because his way of working and the grid and the pixel is, when you view it up close or you get into the pixelization, there's just a really beautiful patterning of abstraction that you can get lost into. And sometimes the images almost just morph into that. But then there's just this representational image of the knockout that he's dealing with in these three images and with the backgrounds. And it's kind of forcing you to contend with these images and this kind of way of working that can morph into different subjects at different times. So I just wanted to thank Peter for curating a beautiful.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, everyone.
And thank you to all the artists. But Ryan, Christina, Lauren, Simon, Carrie,
Jeffrey,
and Robert, who can't be with us today. Thank you for sharing your visions in very thoughtful works of art. It's a joy bringing these works together in this show. And thank you, audience, for attending, and the people viewing this video. If you want to view this show or other shows, you can go onto our website at parkplace.gallery. If you want to purchase the works, they're available online at Artsy or Kunis, or you can contact the gallery directly at parkplacebklyn@gmail.com. And thank you all for attending, and have a nice day.